So everybody's asking the same questions. Is Bitcoin's bull run over? Is Bitcoin losing strength? And is ETH quietly starting to outperform? We have a Bitcoin whales rotating into Ethereum, Ethereum outperforming into December, and Bitcoin dominance looking extremely toppy. So today we're going to ask one big question. Is Bitcoin's run over? Or is this a quiet rotation inside a much larger trend? So we're going to start macro. First, we will be analyzing Bitcoin dominance. Then we will head over into ETH. ETH against the Bitcoin, a 2019 historical chart for BTC, and also a 2-hour time frame liquidity hunt trading setup for you degenerates. So let's start with what's happening off of the chart, because the macro backdrop is currently wild. Japan's planned 20% crypto tax cut could unleash retail demand. Now, if this tax cut does get approved, this will open up a massive retail demand for the region. Now, this might cause a snowball effect because lower tax equals more incentives to participate, which initially means more global demand and liquidity coming into the space, which now brings us over to our second piece of news, where whales are dumping millions of Bitcoin for Ethereum. Look on Chain just spotted a whale swapping 502 Bitcoin for 14,500 ETH worth $45 million. In total, this whale has now converted 1,969 Bitcoin into 58,000 Ethereum. This is not somebody rage quitting. This is deliberate rotation, which now brings us over to our next piece of macro news, where Ethereum is quietly outperforming Bitcoin into December. Ethereum now sits 8% up in positive returns, whilst Bitcoin is only up a mediocre 2.19%. Every time this happened, altcoins exploded. Alts lag, and then they eventually catch fire in the storm. History is repeating, and a front run into the rotation is looking to be on the cards, which literally signifies the same movie but a new cycle. And if we actually look into the diagram for Bitcoin monthly returns and Ethereum monthly returns, one prime example is Bitcoin outrunning in December at 38% positive and then turning negative into January of 2018. Looking at Ethereum, Ethereum was up 70%, outperforming Bitcoin in December, and whilst Bitcoin was in red in January 2018, Ethereum then pushed up another 52%. A quiet rotation could be happening right under our eyes. Which now leads us onto our final piece of macro news before analyzing the charts. And this is Visa just set 2026 for AI and full tokenization. Network tokens make cards an identity layer. And if agents can pay, KYA beats UX and audits the moat. So macro says two things at once. Firstly, Bitcoin is still the anchor. Secondly, the rotation engine is finally gearing up its revs, which leads us over to our first chart of the day, where we will be analyzing Bitcoin dominance. Now, I want you to focus on this ascending, broadening wedge structure that we have down here in the bottom of our screens, because this is a massive bearish pattern. Now, how it started was from back in June 2023. Bitcoin dominance created a resistance and support trend line with higher highs and higher low structure. Now, this formation continued all the way up to the top of this wedge channel into June of 2025 until we finally came back down to support in September and actually lost the support trend line. Now, since losing the support, we have seen a successful retest back into the trend line in late November, or early November, should I say, and are now finally seeing Bitcoin dominance start to roll over and reject from this retest. So finally, it looks like Bitcoin is done sucking oxygen out of the market, and capital could be rotating into Ethereum and potentially altcoins somewhere in the near short term. This is a very bullish outlook for the rest of the market, which leads us over to Ethereum. Now, if we look at Ethereum at this moment in time, there is a strong level of resistance on its head in this black line, and we also have an immediate supply block above that sits roughly at 3.5 to 3.6 25K. However, there is this ascending level of support, and you can see that we're currently climbing up this ascending level of support and getting really tight and compressed into a corner. So a decision is likely to occur in the coming weeks. Just which way will it break? Again, we have imminent supply block above, sitting in the 3.5 to 3.7K territory, and we also have the potential demand zone below, which sits between sort of 2.8 and 2.5K over at these previous levels of resistance from sort of May to June. And we also have the lows of June 2025 as well to act as support below. So key points to take away: as long as Ethereum is above this big green demand block, then the structure is still constructive. If Ethereum does decide to come out and take out its supply, then this is where things start to get really exciting. Nonetheless, it's very evident to see, that we have compression into a corner, which typically leads to expansion. All eyes on Ethereum. Now, this leads us over to a very important chart, and this is Ethereum versus Bitcoin, where we have a falling wedge structure with a level of resistance, a current level of support, a level of resistance, back down to support, and we initially got a massive breakout in late November and have since had this corrective phase where we're actually holding the previous resistance line and have since seen a breakout. Now, this coincides with ETH outperforming Bitcoin heading into December, and we ultimately have a sort of trend line here that we're adhering to, some sort of curve. You can see that Ethereum is bouncing up, coming back to support on this trend line, rallying up again, coming back to support, and now looks like it wants to go for another short-term rally. This is ultimately a very bullish signal because we did have in the past previous lower highs and lower low structure over time. However, this pattern that ETH is actually in is a bullish reversal pattern, and this breakout could solidify a strengthening trend. Now, that leads us over to another very important chart, and this is a chart going back to 2019 for Bitcoin and analyzing COVID, the Black Swan event, and where QT initially ended before a massive markup phase. So what we actually have on the charts here is a MACD and also the 20 moving average. So back in 2019, QT ended, but the MACD printed a bearish cross. And this is where we actually saw a massive rollover for Bitcoin, even after QT's end, formed a huge wick during the Black Swan event of COVID, and then placed a humongous rally from the low sort of, I think it was about 6 to 7K, up to $69,000. Now, the key components to take away from this chart is one, the 20-month EMA for Bitcoin, or the moving average, should I say, even though we had the Black Swan event for COVID, still maintained structure on its lows from sort of March and April 2020 before holding it as support and pushing on to those explosive highs. And although we had the bearish MACD cross, this was a false signal before one of the largest rallies for Bitcoin to date. So the point isn't that we're actually going to mimic this Black Swan COVID event. It's simply that although bearish signals can occur, this does not definitively mean the end of the overall macro structure. This was a false signal before that massive explosion. The MACD took off into the skies, and Bitcoin's price never looked back until 2021. So key things to take away from this chart: bearish MACD crosses can happen, QT can occur, we can witness these Black Swan / COVID style events, but history doesn't have to repeat. And the ultimate thing to take away is, although Bitcoin does look bearish at times, the narrative flip switches within a flash. Now, this leads us over to our next chart of the day, which is the ascending triangle pattern on the 4-hour. And we have been covering this in the last few videos for Bitcoin. And what we ultimately have on this scenario here is a massive compression range between a supply block and an imminent demand block. So we have a setup where Bitcoin is currently caught in this range between resistance and support and is currently sitting back inside the demand area, where in previous occasions, i.e. early December, we have seen some nice bounces back into the supply block. So at this moment in time, yes, there is compression. We are sitting back down into the demand area and also are close to putting in the the point of contact back on this higher low trend line. So at this moment in time, an ascending triangle is a bullish reversal pattern. We have a flat line of resistance and supply, but we are building higher low formations as we speak. Hold the trend line, we could see a push back up imminently into the supply block. However, if we do lose it, this is where Bitcoin could start retracing back down to the lows that it came from late November, and even potentially into early to mid November. And these ranges sit at lows of roughly 84K, and the lower end of the territory sits roughly about $80,000. Now, again, we haven't got a definitive move. However, we are waiting for the decision to see which direction price action wants to head next on the lower time frame. So at this moment in time, this is just noise inside the structure whilst we patiently wait, which now brings us over to the trades back to back. Now, this one is for you if you're a degenerate. The 2-hour time frame, we had a perfect retest entry here in the supply block, which offered a massive opportunity to go short back down into our take profit area from the lows of early December. And at this point here, we got a massive liquidity sweep before running back into the supply block in the 93K territory, which offered a perfect retest entry. And now price has finally rolled over back down into the take profit area, where we are waiting for a decision to either push into the supply block once again, which may offer another retest entry. Losing the take profit area, we ultimately swoop back down into the liquidity and demand pocket, roughly in the sort of 88 to 86K territory. Very interesting, and at this moment in time, there is a hunt for both sides of the equation and no definitive answer. We simply analyze structure and again wait for a decision. Nonetheless, there's been some beautiful trades that we've placed successfully over the last previous couple of days, with retests and perfect entries in supply and a perfect entry back down in the take profit area to run back into that supply block. So right now, there are no signals here, there are no calls, but if you understand the dance, then you stop chasing and actually start observing. But is Bitcoin dead? And the short answer based on the charts and the data is no. Bitcoin dominance is entering a rotation phase and does look like to be heading towards its funeral. ETH has major demand in a constructive format. We have ETH against Bitcoin outperforming Bitcoin heading into December, which has historically been a very bullish signal. The 2019 chart for Bitcoin does have some scary signs, but in the past have presented with false signals. For now, Bitcoin is ranging and back down at a critical level of support, awaiting for direction in the market. So right now, the market isn't choosing between Bitcoin or Ethereum. In fact, it could be setting up the next phase where Bitcoin hands the baton over into ETH and the rest of the market's hands. And don't forget, if you are one of the people who are actually trading this rotation live, we have attached our platform link below where you can find real tools. If not, stick around for your normal dopamine hits. Until next time, stay sharp.